Dear church, let's talk apologetics. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley, joined by my co-worker friend, Blake Dozier, back for another episode.
Back for another episode.
Appreciate it so much. We've been talking apologetics. This is part 2. Last week, we discussed the false dichotomy between science, which says, we just look at facts and evidence, and faith, which is more emotional, and you just go by, your feelings. And we talked about how that's a false dichotomy that Jesus never asked anyone to follow blindly, that blind faith is actually an oxymoron and not something that we, believe in. And we talked about, how to be a Christian, to be a disciple, you are to consider the evidence. And we gave some examples of that. And you go back and listen to that podcast on Spotify or iTunes. So in part 2 today, we're going to look at Romans 1, and then we're going to close our Bibles. And we're going to set it aside. I know that sounds strange for a podcast that's based on the Bible and based on spiritual discussion, but we're actually going to look at, can we make sense of faith and God and the existence of God without even Scripture in hand? And I think we can.
I think we can too.
Yeah.
And I think that's an uncomfortable spot for a lot of us who are believers to put ourselves in. And so we're a little hesitant to even say that. You mean we're going to close our Bibles? Yeah. But I also think we have to recognize that, a lot of people in the world have no belief in the Bible. Right. And so as we're sitting here trying to offer a defense for our faith, which is what apologetics is, where do we start if we don't have this common foundation? And I don't think the Bible is always the best place to start in some of those cases. We have to build up to that, and I think we'll do that over the next couple of weeks. But my permission to do that comes from Romans chapter 1, and so I think that is really important that we start there, like you mentioned.
I agree. It's almost sacrilegious to say we're not gonna start with the Bible, or that maybe that's not the best reference point. But I think sometimes we feel like everyone has to be at our level when we start the discussion, and they have to have the knowledge that we have. Sometimes we do that in the church. It's like, come in, get baptized, then we'll talk kind of thing. Right. You got to take people where they're at. And we have to understand that in many of our conversations, we can quote the Bible and stuff, but there would be somebody sitting across from us going, yeah, but I don't believe that. I don't believe in God, and I don't believe that He wrote a book. And so therefore, where do we start? So let's start with Romans 1, and then let's close our Bibles and put it aside.
Okay, let's do it. All right, so in Romans chapter 1, I'm going to start reading in verse 18.
Okay.
It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." Okay. And so I look at this verse, and it makes several powerful statements. But mainly it says that there are things that can be known about God that are plain to all men.
Sure.
And so I look at that and I think, there's a subset of things that are not plain. Right. We can't look at creation and learn about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Right. That would be what we would consider specific revelation that comes through Scripture itself. But there is a broader general revelation that is very obvious by just looking at the world around us.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what Paul is talking about here in Romans. He's saying, hey, there's a group of people. In fact, he says it later in verse 21 that chose to ignore God. Yeah. He said men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. And really what he's saying is, when we look, we see some things.
Yeah.
And for us to reject this idea of God is for us to reject this general evidence of what we see. And so for me, that gives me permission to say, okay, hold on just a second. What is Paul talking about? What is this truth that is evident to all men? What is it that when we close our Bibles, we can still see?
Yeah.
I think we can still see a lot.
Yeah, so look around you basically is what Paul is saying. That
I think so.
Even if you dismiss Scripture as the source, as our Exhibit A when it comes to the evidence, even if you dismiss that, is there anything else outside of Scripture that shows us that God exists or that there is a designer or a creator of all of this? And I think absolutely. You look at nature, you look at all the inner workings of biology and things like that. Of course, I do want to say this. I meant to say this earlier on. So you went to Abilene Christian University, majored in physics, if I'm correct, right? Took a lot of physics classes.
I took a lot of physics classes. I had an interdisciplinary degree, so I didn't really it doesn't count for anything, I guess, but I did take a lot of physics.
So you
classes.
took a lot of physics. You were very heavy in the sciences, heavily weighted in the sciences in your major. Went to medical school, got about halfway through, year and a half into medical school, did a lot of the gross anatomy, all that kind of stuff, and just decided, I don't think I want to spend this much time in school and spend the rest of my life, doing this kind of profession. And so you left that, and now here you are in ministry. So I say all that to say that you do have some in-depth knowledge about this because you have focused on the sciences and you have integrated that with your faith. And in all of your studies, I know you've said it before, the science only complemented and encouraged your faith and vice versa, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So you can speak to the fact that this is very much a false dichotomy between science and faith, that actually there's not a dichotomy, that they commingle.
No, I believe so. I'm definitely not qualified in any of those areas, So I mean, in one regard, I haven't maybe put in the work to go in depth in any of those fields, but I have a broad enough exposure, I think, to kind of see some of the connections between them all, and I hope that that's being leveraged in the ministry as a blessing and a tool for God.
There's no doubt. And I just wanted our listeners and viewers to understand that, especially those that may be skeptical, that this is not just, some guy that's joining me on the podcast that, has read a few books. There's a little more to it than that.
Now, if I say anything completely wrong about physics, then our Jim Drachenberg, he's a professor of physics at ACU and one of our deacons. He can sweep in and correct me.
Yes, he has been on the podcast as well, and so maybe we should invite him.
Jim was my lab TA my freshman year.
Really?
Yeah, he was.
Huh?
He was.
That's crazy.
Yep.
Yeah. Maybe we need to import him.
We may need to.
Yeah, have him on here.
He can come in and correct any of my errors. So.
There you go. So we're closing our Bibles.
Okay.
We're setting it aside. And after what Paul said, we think he gives us permission to do that. And so now we're looking at general revelation as we see it around us. Just look around. I think Paul's saying that. Just look around.
Yes.
Just see, whatever it may be. The changing of the leaves.
Right.
Look at, especially if you do even more in-depth study into biology and to cells and to, just life in general. Right. I always say this, that, of course, I had a foundational, a foundation in faith growing up, but where it really hit home to me is when my first child was born and you hold your baby for the first time. It's in my mind, it was impossible to not think that there is a God. That just life itself, is just amazing. When you hold it in your hands, but also when you look at DNA and all those kind of things. It's hard to ignore. Right.
It seems like almost everywhere we look, there's a little piece of evidence that is just really difficult to explain with the theories that the scientific community has put in place. And maybe I shouldn't say it like that, because maybe that's feeding that dichotomy a little bit. There's some bigger questions that aren't answered. Yeah. Maybe I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
There's some holes in the picture. There's an incompleteness that I find at every turn. And so whether we're dabbling in philosophy or science, which tend to overlap, there really just are some things that don't make sense. So we could look at, and I didn't necessarily come prepared to talk about a handful of these, but the issue of morality.
Yeah.
Where do morals come from? The beauty. Why do humans even see and have the ability to appreciate beauty? That serves no evolutionary purpose. Yeah. The idea of logic. Why does the world work in predictable, patterned ways? Or I could even go so far as to say just the very idea of thinking itself. Mm-hmm. I mean, somewhere in your brain there are thoughts that are you that you can't escape from.
Yeah. The mind, the intellect.
The mind, the intellect. So, I mean, how is it that people are even able to have this consciousness that we have, these thoughts that we have? How are we able to reason and work through things? And all of those are difficult to explain completely with the models that we have in place.
Yeah, the morality argument is a big one.
It is.
And you know, just this innate, this intrinsic, I don't know what you'd call it, force, belief inside of us that, you know, maybe not every single person. There are some people that are pretty broken. There are some people who have certain, you know, maladies, handicaps, for instance, that may not be able to think through it like we're talking about. But I think the average person, of course, is able to say, okay, this is wrong. Even if I didn't have that standard, there's just this intrinsic morality that, okay, cheating on my wife is not the right thing. I can justify it in my mind, but we know deep down that that's not right. Killing someone, you know, whatever it is, stealing. We understand that there is this moral code, even if we don't believe in God, even if we don't even the atheist, you know, would admit that.
No, I mean, and it's inescapable. Society would collapse without some sort of moral code or moral standards. And so while there has been some moving back and forth on some peripheral issues where we would land on them, there've been some key things that societies have held to pretty steadily and held to them pretty strongly. And you know, one would ask, why? What gives us permission to have a moral code to begin with?
Yeah.
And I mean, that becomes a very philosophical question very fast, but it is very difficult to give yourself permission to say something is right or wrong if you don't rely on some sort of supreme giver of truth who says this is right and this is wrong, who sets the standard, who sets the bar.
Yeah, who determines what is good. Because even the person who doesn't believe in God would say, well, you know, you are to do good, or we are to be good. So what is good?
You know, I mean, I'll give an example. I've become the sexpert, right? And so I guess I have to work that into most of my talks. But you know, in the area of human sexuality, you know, there's been a lot of changes recently in what society has deemed acceptable and not acceptable, but there's still a standard.
Absolutely,
there's still a standard. In fact, I would say our culture as a whole still believes consent is absolutely necessary. Why? I mean that. Why is that the one that we have landed on? What gives us permission to say, okay, we're gonna wade through all of this and we're gonna set aside this and say this was, you know, this issue is a cultural one and this issue is a cultural one, but eventually we get to this one issue of consent, and that there is the line that we cannot cross. If you cross that line, you are immoral. Period. Well, okay, but I mean, even at that, it tells me what gives you permission to make that call. Well, there has to be a bigger than us truth to be able to make that determination, or it's just a social construct that can be changed as society moves.
And virtually all of us recognize that line. So I mean,
it's universally recognized, and we see that across. This type of moral standard across all cultures and all time. And I mean, that points us to a big reality that there has to be something bigger out there that has set that within us and caused us to make those determinations.
Yeah. So if you're looking at evidence, you have to consider those things as well. You can't dismiss that.
Absolutely.
Obviously.
Now, I'm a physics guy, so that's not the one that I tend to run towards first.
Right.
Some of our more philosophically minded people might go to arguments on morality. I love what apologists would call the cosmological arguments.
Yeah. So without getting way too deep, because maybe some of our audience would appreciate that.
You saw my notes, and in other words, that's your nice way of saying, can you not say all of that stuff that's on your notes?
I know for me, dumb it down, but I'm not saying that our audience needs it to be dumbed down. But I think that if you were to put it in simple terms, explain to us the cosmological argument.
Okay.
I mean, the way I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understand the cosmological argument in like the rawest form is. All of this was designed. I mean, for something doesn't come from nothing.
Something doesn't come from nothing.
And so if you have something, you have to have something that made it.
Right. Yeah. The basic cosmological argument would go like this. And I'm going to lay it out. I'll actually just read it. There's some simple statements that stack on top of one another.
Okay.
And this is the reason I lay it out this way is because this is basically, this is a logical series of statements.
Okay.
If A is true and B is true, then C must be true.
Gotcha.
And so we can kind of work through it like that.
Okay.
So premise number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause.
Okay.
Premise number two, the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause.
Okay.
In other words, it follows. So if everything that began to exist has a cause and the universe began to exist, well, it follows that the universe has a cause. So that's the way this argument works. And so you would ask yourself, well, to disprove that, to say, I do not believe that the universe has a cause. Well, what do you have to do? You either have to disprove premise one or premise two. You have to say, okay, well, maybe something could begin to exist without a cause. Then you can get around this.
Yeah.
Or maybe the universe didn't begin to exist.
Yeah.
Then you can also get around this. And so we look at it and we examine those things and say, well, can that be true? It was interesting. I was talking to some high school kids about premise number one, whatever begins to exist have a cause. And I said, can you think of anything
Yeah.
that exists and does not have a cause? And I mean, like typical high school kids, you get a few answers here and there, and then one of them really had me tricked. You could see this light go on, and he kind of lit up, and he raised his hand, and he said, "I lived in this house, and it was haunted." And he goes through this whole story about these doors opening and closing and all of that. And I listened to him, and I got to the end and said, "Oh, you think you've disproved? You think that you've said, well, there was this spiritual force that made this thing happen, but." Really, what you just told me is you cannot make sense of reality without the law of cause and effect in place.
Right.
When you don't see the cause, you make one up.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of reasons that door could have moved. The house shifted. There was a draft. We could think of all sorts of reasons, but because you didn't see or understand them, then you felt the need to fill that gap in knowledge with something else.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the reality is we cannot make sense of a world where the cause and effect relationship isn't in place. We just can't. And so we look at the world around us and truthfully, we exist. This is real.
Yep.
There's a few people who so much want to get away from this idea of there being a supreme being that they try to claim this is all an illusion.
It's a figment of our imagination. Yeah.
We could go there, but that collapses on itself pretty quickly.
It does.
The basic reliability of our senses tells us that we are here and we do exist and this is real. And therefore, based on everything that we see in nature, there must be a cause.
Yeah.
science would not work if this was not the case.
Yeah. So we all have to begin there.
Yeah,
we all have to start with.
We all have to. I think most of us can agree on premise number one: everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Yeah.
So then that takes us to premise number two: the universe began to exist.
Yeah.
Now this is one that I think is pretty interesting. A lot of our believers are probably, or a lot of our listeners are probably believers and may have different opinions about the Big Bang Theory. So I'm not here to make any sort of theological statement about whether it is true or not, whether that's how God created the universe or not. Let's just set that aside for a second, and let's just take the Big Bang Theory and admit it is the most widely accepted view at this point in history of how the universe came into existence.
Yes.
And so, I mean, the Big Bang Theory essentially based its evidence on the fact that our universe is expanding. So we look out from any point into the universe, and we can tell through various scientific measurements that everything is running away from everything else. It's kind of like, they're actually called those Habermas spheres. Our listeners can Google that, but it's the little toy that as you pull out, it's this ball and it expands, it has all the little links and it expands and it contracts. And, it's like
we should have brought one
like
of
a
those.
fidget spinner.
Yeah.
I know. I wanted to buy one, but they're kind of expensive.
Oh, really?
So, I mean, maybe if we're going to have these talks often enough, I could invest in a Habermas sphere. But
but not at this point.
Yeah, but not at this point. No. But anyway, so you can imagine one of those, and it expands, and that's kind of what's happening with the universe. Well, if you just pushed pause and you ran the clock in reverse, then you would see everything contracting. And everything would ultimately contract down to a central point. And beyond that, where could you go? I mean, nowhere. The most widely accepted scientific theory has built within it the understanding that there was a beginning.
Yeah.
That the universe began to exist. That there was a moment in time when everything started, and from that, everything else, everything else emanated and came into being. So even the Big Bang Theory would point to the truth of premise number two, that the universe began to exist. That there was a point in time when that happened. Another thing I like to point people to, and Jim would like this one, the second law of thermodynamics.
Yes.
That makes it sound pretty scary, but the second law of thermodynamics is one we all know very well.
We've experienced it.
As we age, our knees don't work like they used to. And as we drive our car, things start falling off of it. And as our house ages, we have to start replacing roofs, and we have plumbing issues. And the reality is, as we look at the world around us, everything is in a state of, or is moving towards a state of further disorder. So we would call that an increase in entropy. Things are always moving from order to disorder.
Right.
So I would illustrate this for people by taking a mason jar. And you could fill it with white beads on the bottom and red beads on the top. And they would be, or jelly beans. We could say jelly beans.
Okay.
And these colored Skittles. We'll say Skittles.
I like
Skittles. Okay. All right. So we've got two colored Skittles. And if it was just set there, they would stay for a long time. But as we started to move this mason jar around, what would happen? They're gonna move towards a state of disorder as they start intermingling and mixing, and no shaking or moving of the jar is ever gonna get one color of jelly of Skittle to rise to the top and one to rise to the bottom. We're never gonna create order by shaking the jar.
Right.
We only create disorder. And that's what we see in the world around us is everything is moving from a state of order to disorder. Right. So then one would ask the question, if that is the case and we ran the clock in reverse, where does that lead us?
Yeah.
Well, it tells us that there must have been a time when everything began for us to start the process of everything running out. Right. Because if there wasn't a beginning, we would have reached maximum disorder a long time ago.
Very true. Yeah.
Okay? If the beginning point of time was infinitely far in history, we couldn't possibly exist today because the universe would have ran out of energy. Yeah. It would be done. So the second law of thermodynamics points us to the fact that the universe had a beginning.
Absolutely.
Another way to illustrate, I mentioned this concept of infinity, and I'm probably going too far, but
keep going.
I'll make one more point,
and
then I'll slow down.
I like it.
If let's say maybe someone's driving while they're listening to this podcast, and so they can safely imagine a line of dominoes across the dashboard of their car.
Yeah,
a line of dominoes. Or maybe someone's sitting in their living room and they can imagine a longer line of dominoes stretched across the room. So we look at those dominoes and it makes me wonder. Okay, if those dominoes went infinitely into the future. Well, hold on. Let me start this over. Let me start this analogy over just a little bit.
Okay.
So what do we do if we have a line of dominoes?
Yeah. We knock them over.
Yeah, we have to knock them over.
Yeah.
I could get like 3 dominoes set up at my house before Braxton would swap in and knock them over. Okay, so we can imagine this imaginary line of dominoes on our, and it's fun for it to be imaginary.
We set them up to knock them over.
Yeah, it's fun for it to be imaginary because then we can knock them over, and it's not costly to set them back up. We just do it in our head.
Right.
Okay, so we knock over this line of dominoes across the top of our dashboard, and bop, 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 they fall, and we've basically started this chain reaction of events that goes on, and it had a start and an ending point. And so we could start imagining longer and longer lines of dominoes, and we knock them and bop, 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 all the way to the end, and it gets to another ending point. That's really a great way of illustrating this idea of cause and effect.
Yeah.
For the domino in position C to fall, the domino in position B must have struck it, and A must have struck it. And so we imagine now that we exist at a particular point in the line of dominoes. Mm-hmm. Okay? For us to get to where we are, all of the dominoes in front of us had to have fallen.
Yeah.
And then here we are at this moment of time, and then time stretches on in front of us. And, and after our domino has fallen, the world will go on and dominoes will continue to fall, this string of cause and effects. So imagine for a moment that the dominoes stretched further and further back in time away from us.
Yeah.
It would take longer and longer for the dominoes to get to us.
Yeah.
Now imagine that the line went infinitely back. Infinitely means there is no beginning. It continues on forever.
Right.
How would we ever get to where we are now? If there is no starting domino,
mm-hmm.
if there was not a point in time for the cause and effect chain to be began,
right,
then it's totally illogical that this moment in time could even exist.
Right.
This is the idea of infinite regress, that it simply can't happen based on everything that we know around us. Without there being a definite starting point, there's no way to get to where we are today.
You have to have that first domino.
You have to have the first domino. You have to have the first domino. And that illustration also, I think, gives us a way of looking at another element, and that is there had to be a first mover.
Yeah.
There had to be something to knock the first domino over. Yeah. There had to be an entity that sat outside of this little world of dominoes that existed independent of it, mm-hmm. that had the power to set it up, mm-hmm. that had the power to choose to reach in and to knock the first domino over, to start the chain. And I mean, without that, it's I was going to say difficult, but I think I might say impossible to explain how anything could exist.
Sure.
How anything could exist. So, I mean, those are some powerful ways that we can argue, not for the God of the Bible yet, but we can argue for the idea that there has to be something bigger out there, that there has to be a cause. If everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, then the universe must have a cause. Yeah. And if that is true, then we can start asking questions about what that cause might be. Yeah. Okay, and that kind of leads us further on in our discussion. There's other arguments we could walk through. I mean, we could talk about the fine-tuning argument and how impossible it would be for this world to happen by chance because it requires such perfection.
Yes.
We've heard about a watch doesn't appear without a watchmaker.
Right.
It's too intricate. Right. And our universe is infinitely more intricate than that. We could talk about DNA. We could talk about the fact that DNA transmits information. The very idea of information being transmitted. Yeah. Wow, that's pretty crazy. It is. If you stop and think about that. There are a lot of other things that we could look at. I got to be honest, Chris. It's a scary thing to genuinely admit and understand that there's something bigger than you. Mm-hmm. I've been a Christian my whole life, and I've been taught that there is. But right. I mean, when I really set that aside a little bit, and I just look and I think, I don't want that to be. In deep inside of me somewhere, I don't want that to be. Right. I don't want to be at the whim of something bigger. Yeah. I don't like that.
It's uncomfortable for sure.
It's uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. I'm much more comfortable landing in a spot. In fact, I think a lot of Christians even land in a spot where they have constructed this view of the world where really they're the center of it and they're in charge. Yeah. And God may be convenient at times, but we want to be in charge. Yeah. And so I look at this reality, and my first temptation is to look away. Yeah. Now, let's not ask those questions. Yeah. Those questions are too big. Right. Let's not land there. That's not where I want to be, because that is a really uncomfortable spot because it makes us very, very vulnerable.
For sure.
But if we're going to approach this and be intellectually honest, there's really no other way to explain existence. There's really no other possible way that this happened without there being some sort of greater power, a supreme being that exists outside of time, that has the ability of making choices. Someone or something that did not begin to exist. Yeah. And that is what we'll turn our attention to next week in trying to unwrap and see if we can figure out, if we can learn anything about that being from Scripture or not. Little sneak preview. The God that the Bible lays forward is not a God that we have to be scared of.
Yeah, for sure.
And it really is interesting how well he fits what we see by looking at these arguments. And it's a great comfort when we see the type of God that he's presented as being, because what is initially scary and terrifying becomes a great comfort as we progress further down this road. So
absolutely,
that's where we're headed.
Absolutely. So we've kind of created a picture that there has to be something behind all of this order, and we're going to get to the point where we believe that something is a holy God.
Right.
But for now, we're going to leave it at that.
Right.
That we believe there's a designer. We believe the evidence points to that.
Right.
And we're going to go from there.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I would challenge our listeners. I mean, they got a better explanation.
Yes.
Let's go for it. Let's ask those questions. I mean, is there a way we can explain reality without God?
right.
I mean, because I am open to that.
Yeah.
I don't see it, but I mean, I'm open to it.
Yeah. And that's one thing that we say on the podcast all the time.
Yeah.
You know, ask questions.
Yeah.
We value questions. We have gotten to the point in our faith because we did question things.
Right.
And so we offer that to you as well. If you have a question or comment, email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you have a question specifically for Blake, I mean, we're just one office apart, one door down. I can give it to him, send it to him, and he would certainly be glad to answer your question as well. But we invite those, we invite that discussion. I hope you'll continue tuning in for this series. We've got a couple more lessons at least to talk about this, and we're moving in a direction that we're eventually going to get to why we believe that God is the purpose and the reason for all of this. But Blake, I want to thank you so much for being with us again today.
I'm loving it.
Yeah,
Appreciate you having me on.
Look forward to next time. It's going to be great. And for all of you, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.